Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Jewish Renaissance's celebration of the centenary of Paul Celan. It's really a delight to welcome you this evening, and we have some fantastic speakers. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, we're going to be hearing from poet and novelist Anne Michaels, from filmmaker Gideon Koppel, and art historian Monica Bohm-Duchen. I'm also really delighted that we have actor Henry Goodman, who's going to be performing some of Celan's poems for us. He's going to be reading the English translations, and we've got a little bit of Celan himself reading the German. So that's going to be the structure of the evening. We're going to hear from each of our guests, and then we're going to bring everyone on screen together and at the end have a Q&A, which gives you as the audience an opportunity to participate. We're running this across a couple of platforms. If you are in the Zoom webinar, please do put your comments, thoughts and questions into the Q&A box. They'll be monitored by our editor, Rebecca, and she'll be feeding them through during the question and answer session at the end. If you're watching on YouTube or one of our other platforms, please put your questions in the comments section, and our associate editor, Danielle, is going to be monitoring that. So hopefully there'll be a chance to feed through as much of the audience participation and query as possible. But I'm going to start off, before I get into it, by acknowledging that we're a very mixed audience. There's a lot of people who are attending this event who are poets themselves, inspired by Celan, who are academics, who are German language speakers. There are also a lot of our Jewish Renaissance subscribers who love Jewish culture, but perhaps know a little less about Celan than others. So I'm going to open this evening by just giving us a brief biographical background to Celan and explaining why the magazine thought it was so important to celebrate the centenary of his birth. So Paul Celan was born on the 23rd of November 1920. It is exactly 100 years since his birth. And he was born to German-speaking parents in Czernowitz, the chief city of Bukovina. So the area that he was born in, I haven't actually put a country to because the borders were constantly changing. It was the eastern outpost of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At times it was Romania, at times occupied by the Soviets, and at others by the Germans. So it was a very fluid piece of land, and that fluidity feeds in very much to his work. So Celan was born as a Jew, an observant, educated Jew. His bar mitzvah when he was 13 coincided pretty much exactly with the Nazi rise to power. So throughout his teenage years, his family were very aware of what was happening and worried about the political implications. He had a kind of pluralist education. At different times, his parents chose education for him that attended to different facets of his identity. He went to German, Romanian and Hebrew schools at different points in his life, and understanding those languages plus several others and moving between them would be key to who he was. He was also active in youth groups. So at one point in his life, he was a member of a Zionist youth group, looking to moving towards Israel. At others, he joined the local anti-fascist youth group. So again, bridging that Jewish identity and a political socialist identity was key from his teenage years. But then tragedy hit. In June 1942, Celan's parents were deported to the Western Ukraine. And it just happened that the day that the Einsatzkommando arrived in Czernowitz, Paul Celan was actually away for the day. So he didn't get taken with them. He arrived home to find the house open and his parents missing. and it took him a long time to know what had happened. But within a month of his parents being taken, he too was interred, although he was interred in forced labour camps in Romania. He was released in spring 1944 when the Soviets occupied, and his friends temporarily got him a job in a psychiatric hospital tending to Soviet airmen. And it's at this point that he discovers his parents' fate. There's a very moving letter that he wrote to one of his childhood friends, Eric. And Celan would later name his own son Eric, possibly after his boyhood friend. So anyway, he wrote to Eric, "Dear Eric, I've come to Kiev for 2 days on official business, and I'm glad of the chance to write you a letter that will reach you quickly. Your parents are well, Eric. I talked with them before I came here. That's saying a lot. You can't imagine how much. My parents were shot by the Germans in Krasnopolka on the Bug River. Eric, oh Eric, there's much to tell. You've seen so much. I've experienced only humiliations and emptiness, endless emptiness. Maybe you can come home." So he was hoping that Eric would join him back in Chernovitz, but actually what happened was Eric couldn't return, but nor could Celan. With war raging, he ended up having to migrate to Bucharest. And then post-war in 1947, he moved again away from the Soviet occupation to Vienna. In 1948, he made his last significant journey, which was to Paris, where he lived out the rest of his life. We're going to hear later a little bit about Gideon's documentary film on Celan, and one of the things I was struck by when I was seeing an excerpt was how much he's described as a ladies' man. He had connections with many women. But he actually married an artist, Giselle de Lestrange, and they had a son in 1955. But after 15 years, so when his son was 15, Celan drowned in the Seine in 1970, probably by his own hand, committing suicide. So Celan's time in Paris was an interesting one. To make a living, he worked as a German teacher, but his real vocation was as a poet and translator, and he was immensely, immensely prolific. His body of writing includes 900 pages of poetry across 11 volumes, 250 pages of prose. Then there's 1,000 pages of his correspondence, much of it to other significant writers. And perhaps even more importantly than his own poetry, he wrote a vast body of translations. He translated mainly into German, but also into Romanian, and he translated from 8 languages. And these translations range from the formal to the free verse, real phenomenal feats. He takes from English, he takes a huge number of really important authors, Shakespeare. Perhaps for me, most interestingly, he got very obsessed by the American poet Emily Dickinson and spent a long time working on translations of her because he found that she didn't slide easily into German and he had to work on her syntax as much as working on the meaning of the words. But he himself actually considered his most important translations, bringing those poets that he thought of as the poetry of testimony, such as that of Osip Mandelstam, into German, and testing the limits of the German language. And that's something we're going to think about quite a lot this evening. We're going to think about Celan's poetry. We're going to think about his translation of others, but we're really going to think about what he meant by testing the limits of the language. To do that, I'm going to, first of all, welcome Anne Michaels to join us. So Anne Michaels is one of my absolute favourite writers, and I'm really thrilled she's with us. Many people on the Zoom will know her, I think, from her novel Fugitive Pieces, which won the Orange Prize. But she's written many other novels and also many collections of poetry, starting in 1986 with The Weight of Oranges. The collection that we're really interested in this evening, although I'm sure Anne's going to talk about other of her own work and of Celan, but in 2013 she wrote a collection called Correspondences, which very much drew on Celan's writing. So I'm really excited to hear Anne talk about that, maybe even read from it, and also possibly talk about Paul Celan's relationship with Nelly Sachs, the Nobel Prize winner. And she writes about, if you want to know more depth, she writes about Celan and Sachs in the latest issue of Jewish Renaissance. So thank you very much for joining us, Anne, and over to you.
My pleasure. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. And thank you all for coming, everyone who is here from wherever you're here from. When we gather like this, it is always an act of hope, and especially important in these times. I am going to talk a bit about Celan and language. And language for Celan was both refuge and torment. The language had been mutilated for him, yet that very mutilation was now part of its meaning. I'm going to talk about his relationship with the poet Nelly Sachs, and read you just a paragraph to set the context for that relationship. In 1954, Paul Celan wrote to Nelly Sachs praising her poetry, especially her poem Chorus of Orphans. Few correspondences have begun with deeper subtext and unspoken longing. Sachs replied, "Dear poet and dear person, Paul Celan." And soon after, "Today I send this greeting to tell you that your letter is among those I will never part with as long as I am alive." They addressed each other as brother and sister. For both, language was a leap of faith, staggering and minimal. The hope that experience might be spoken, in some way represented, even if there is no listener. A language the dead might understand and trust. Only in the particular space of their correspondence was there for both no exile. On the 25th of May, 1960, Sachs and Celan met for the first time at the Stork Inn, a cafe on the River Limmat in Zurich. They met only once more in Paris, where Celan lived with his wife and son. Their correspondence was essential and lasted throughout years of, for each, intermittent breakdown. In April 1970, Celan left his apartment, crossed the street, and drowned himself in the River Seine. Sachs died the day Celan was buried. Sachs and Celan corresponded for decades, many years, and that correspondence was essential to them both. Sachs had fled to Sweden and lived there with her mother until her mother died. And although they only met twice, their intimacy, their understanding of each other was crucial, each crucial to the other. For Celan, the German language was contaminated. It was both the mother's tongue and the murderer's tongue. And if he was to write the poem correctly, any poem correctly, that language, which was contaminated, would have to contaminate the reader. because any witness coming forward from the war would have to contaminate the listener. It was inevitable. It couldn't be otherwise. And in a sense, also the reader could not heal the poet in return. So language was, for Celan, some poems are born of silence, and some poems are born of speechlessness. But for Celan and for Sachs, their poems were born of speechlessness. And that is the difference between silence and muteness. There was dispossession at the very core of the enterprise of writing, the exact dispossession at the exact place of intention and meaning. In the same way, a poem is also an assertion, the way suicide is an assertion, the way the dying is an assertion of self. I'd like to, Aviva asked whether I would read from a book that I wrote called Correspondences, and that's a book that talks very much about the relationship between Nelly Sachs and Paul Celan, but also was written as a kind of shelter for those who lived through those years, those, of course, also for the dead. It was meant, the book is an accordion book. It stretches across the room. The first lines of the book, the poem, it's a book-length poem, and the first line is also the last line, making a complete circle. It was meant to be a place for many people, the dead from many countries, from scientists to writers to teachers to painters, a place of shelter so all could gather and understand. Everyone at that table would understand each other intimately, even if they didn't speak the same language, because of what they had experienced. So I think maybe the best thing for me to do is to just begin by reading. Not our memory of the dead, but what the dead remember. They met in Zurich Stork on Ascension Day, 26th of May, 1960, and each touched the face of the other to read what was no longer there. All the ways we say goodbye for the last time, this, their first meeting. At the cafe, the radio was tuned to silence. Celan asked the waiter to turn it down. Even in their stillness, in their perfect camouflage, even hidden among the baby's blankets, it found them. They both heard the white cornfield, restless above the squealing trams. They met at Zurich's stork, the stork that is the Greek hieroglyphic for soul, the Greek stork that at death takes human form and brings children into the house and cares for the old, the Slavic stork carrying unborn souls to earth, the Hebrew stork meaning mercy, the German stork with its human spirit and its protection against fire, the stork with its white wings dipped in black, the stork with its nest in the chimney. Celan rushed from Paris to Stockholm and stood forever unadmitted outside her hospital door. come as quickly as possible, Sachs had written, and then don't, under any circumstances, come. The smallest detail gives them away. The paper pulled from the typewriter, shoes beside the bed. Nothing must be too straight or neat. They came while I was out, Sachs explained. I knew it immediately, though they were as cunning as I, and left things exactly as they were. Sachs was in hospital several times. She had several breakdowns over the course of their friendship, and Celan as well. And this knowledge of that darkness was something unspoken and absolutely intimately understood between the two of them. The sense of there not being even refuge in the writing of the poetry, the thought that there was no shelter in what was the thing deepest, of the deepest moral intention, was absolute dispossession for both of them. And that sense that the language was contaminated, that the poem was contaminated and contaminating, the sense that that drop of poison was like a black drop of ink in milk, turning the milk black. And that, of course, is a well-known image of Celan's, the black milk of morning. Poems arrive in the mail like an old friend on a rainy afternoon. Sachs' homesickness scar. After all, there was no longer paranoia, no such category as too much fear. Celan saw into the same water where his son and his wife had so recently floated a school excursion on a riverboat, unhurried as the current, as still as a surface before it is touched by consciousness. Because to touch means always. They wanted you to shout oranges in the street, a few coins from the grocer to raise your voice. But you stared at the pyramid of perfume and oil and instinctively smelled your fingers for the vanished scent and felt into your pocket for the bit of peel carried since, and stood the mud of another country still on your shoes, silenced by that bit of earth. While Celan in Paris wept for the same contraband, ranger and grancé, gnawing and grinding, between voix and voix, voice and path, between converse and its converse, between Ansel and Celan, between Meyer and Amory, between the Naaman and the Prout, between the Prout and the Seine, between Soph and Soif, rescue and thirst. And two last small sections. Come, it's time to set the table. Dusk is bruised with rain. The water is alive under the wind. Evening is upon us. Outside, the animals make their accommodation. The lake loses its reflection, settles deeper. Set down the brush on the saucer. Leave off the book, open with its words against the pillow. The washing of hands, the tea kettle, the whiskey, stocking feet on the wooden floor. Help me carry the chairs, never enough chairs, through the narrow doorway, chairs borrowed from the sewing table, from the desk, from the work table, paint spattered and mended with wire. Bring the piano bench. Find the perfect symphony for parsing vegetables into broth. No need for candles. We'll see each other well enough in the dark. Draw close your father's chair next to my father's, and I'll fetch a book for the orphan's chair so she can reach the table. And last, a chair for the mourner who accompanies the body, so the soul is never, not for a single moment, alone. The surface of the water cut and mended, scissored into endless fragments and joinings, places for the light to settle, then drown and settle again. A line break, forever changing the word above and the word below, altered by a breath. I'll just close by saying that between Nellie Sachs and Celan was a speechlessness that was its own language. And I would say that is a language understood by anyone who lived through those years. And it is the language that the dead understands and trusts. This torment that was Celan's relationship to language was never a wound, never ever to be answered. For many writers, the sense of a reader, the idea of a reader itself is a kind of solace, even if that listener is only the page itself. But for Celan, there was no solace. That solace was denied him because the sense of witness and testimony meant that he had to write in German, the language that for him was mutilated. And if he wrote the poem correctly, then that, again, as I said before, would have to contaminate the reader. And so there was no healing to be had, no remedy to be made, no answer to that eternal dispossession. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. So we're starting on a kind of somber note, but also a note about the inadequacy of language or the struggle with language. And yet I'm so aware of something Anne once wrote about her own poetry, where she said poetry isn't about, it's about holding experience, not about holding on to experience, but about holding it. And I think maybe that's the kind of positive thing that Celan is doing. He's constantly wrestling with language for himself, and yet he's using it to hold that experience for us, the readers. So to give you a taste of that, we're going to have the first of one of three of Celan's poems actually that are going to run through the session. I'm really pleased that we have Henry Goodman here with us. Henry is an actor who over his career has been across stage and screen and audio, won Olivier Awards for both Best Actor in a Musical and Best Actor in a Play. One of my favourites was seeing him in Yes, Prime Minister. So he's a consummate actor, but he's also really noted for his Jewish roles. I remember Anthony Sher describing him once as simply the best Shylock he'd ever seen, because he brought out that torment and identity. So we thought he was the perfect person to read Celan for us. And the first poem we're going to invite him to read is the poem that Celan wrote for Nellie Sachs, At the Stork Inn. So if I just momentarily share my screen and show you before we bring Henry up, this is actually the Stork Inn at Zurich on the river that you can see, so you can have it in your mind's eye as Henry reads to us. So Henry, over to you.
Thank you. Of too much was our talk, of too little, of the you and you again, of how clarity troubles, of Jewishness, of your God, of that. On the day of an ascension, the minister stood over there. It sent some gold across the water. Of your God was our talk. I spoke against him. I let the heart that I had hope for his highest death rattled his quarreling word. Your eye looked on, looked away. Your mouth spoke its way to the eye, and I heard, we don't know, you know. We don't know, do we? What counts?
Thank you. So we're going to bring Henry back a little bit later on to read another of Celan's poems, and I've given him the dreadful task of reading a poem after Celan reads it for us himself. But before we do that, I'd like to bring Gideon Koppel onto the screen. Gideon is a filmmaker who is currently in the middle of making a feature-length documentary about Celan. He's a graduate of the Slade School of Fine Art. His work's been screened internationally and exhibited in galleries from the Tate Modern in London to MoMA, New York. In 2010, Gideon won the Guardian First Feature Film Award for Sleep Furiously, which has been described as a mutually gorgeous, moving and deeply poetic work of art, simply a masterpiece. So I think he's a very safe pair of hands to be handling a film about Celan and making a film about Celan. But I'm really interested in how he's looking at Celan and the people that he's brought together to talk about Celan. Because as much as Celan was looking at others, Celan's become an object for a gaze from all around the world and across decades. So Gideon, over to you.
Thank you, Aviva. I'm amused at the idea of being a safe pair of hands. I think that's the first time I've ever been called a safe pair of hands. It was wonderful hearing Henry read the poem Stork Inn, and in fact that's an interesting sort of intro to talking about my sort of journey of making a film about or around Paul Celan. I was in the Stalk-In exactly 3 years ago, I think almost to the day, meeting the actor Bruno Ganz, who sadly died. And I was meeting with Bruno because we were talking about Celan, and Bruno lived, I think, about 20 kilometers away from Zurich, but thought that that would be an appropriate place for us to meet and talk about Celan, and he was going to do some readings for the film, but as I said, sadly died. Paul Celan, or is it Celan or Celan? I don't know. I'll doubtless try out several different versions of pronouncing his name this evening. Born today, the 23rd of November, 1920, exactly 100 years ago. There's something special about that kind of idea about exactly 100 years ago appeals to the child in me. And I remember the beginnings of my struggle to imagine time. And I would imagine time by repeating words over and over again. In this case, I would repeat the word year over and over again, probably 100 times, in the hope that I would get a sense of what that time, 100 years, means. On my desk today is a slim book, a beautiful book titled To Duration by Peter Handke. It was a gift from a close friend. And it begins, for a long time, I've wanted to write about duration. Not an essay, not a play, not a story. Duration calls for a poem. Want to question myself with a poem, remember with a poem, claim and reclaim with a poem what duration is. Handke later goes on to think about what he means by duration. This duration, what was it? Was it an interval of time? Something measurable, a certitude? No, duration was a feeling, most fleeting of all feelings. I think those lines suggest something about why I started to make a film around and about Paul Celan. I'm not a good reader. I read like the character from Hrabel's Too Loud a Solitude. When I read, I don't really read. I pop a beautiful sentence in my mouth and suck it like a fruit drop, or I sip it like a liqueur until the thought dissolves in me like alcohol, infusing my brain and heart and coursing through the veins to the root of each blood vessel. So it's not the literary complexities of Celan's work that first appealed. For those of you who know my film work, looking and listening are the ways I tend to learn about the world. Looking and listening are of time and of duration. I reflect on a memory of visiting an exhibition of paintings by Paul Klee, an artist that Celan admired and references quite a lot in his notebooks and letters. Thousands of people crowding the galleries, all patiently waiting to file past the small, delicate images. There really seems to be something about the quality of Klee's work which audiences are thirsty for and responsive to. And despite the vast numbers of people, there is a sense of calm contemplation in the atmosphere of the crowd, not pushing or shoving like these kinds of high visibility exhibitions usually provoke. Paul Klee's work is of its time and place, German-speaking Europe across the two world wars, but there's also a timelessness and a placelessness, and maybe even as Anne was talking about, a speechlessness. The images are small, detailed, and on the surface modest. The viewer is invited to peer in and make discoveries for themselves, to take personal risks. For most, there are very few clues about how and where to look. The engagement is sensory rather than intellectual. And while Klee was clearly billed as a significant artist of the 20th century, there are no superlatives around, no mention of how much his paintings are worth in dollars, no bold statements to evoke a sensationalism. In these crowded galleries and in the queues waiting to go in, any notion of value seems to remain qualitative, that is to say, immeasurable in its distinction. Art does not reproduce the visible, rather it makes it visible, Clay wrote in 1920. As I understand it, Clay is saying that art is not a form of representation, but more an exploration of the world. Celan wrote something similar about poems in a letter in 1952 to a school student. He wrote that poems are, and I quote, an attempt to grapple with reality, an attempt to gain reality, to make reality visible. Thus, reality for the poem is in no way something fixed, predetermined, but something that is at issue, something to be questioned. The first time I read Celan, I wrote down a sentence which had a powerful resonance then and still does. It's a line from Backlight, and I read a translation by Rosemary Waldrop. So strong was his love for her, it would have pushed open the lid of his coffin, had the flower she placed there not been so heavy. It is often said that there's a darkness to Celan's world, and I don't entirely go along with it, but if there is, I perceive it a bit like the darkness Bion, the psychoanalyst, describes. He wrote, instead of trying to bring a brilliant, intelligent, knowledgeable light to bear on obscure problems, we bring a diminution of the light, a penetrating beam of darkness, a reciprocal of the searchlight. The darkness would be so absolute that it would achieve a luminous absolute vacuum. So if any object existed, however faint, it would show up very clearly. Happy birthday, Paul Celan.
Thank you very much, Gideon. And we're really lucky that we're going to get a little preview clip from Gideon's film a bit later on in the evening. He's interviewed some amazing people, including George Steiner. So we're going to hear a little later on from that George Steiner interview to finish the night. But before we hear from a film about Celan, I want to hear Celan's voice itself. His most famous poem, which Anne referred to earlier with the Black Milk of Daybreak, is Todesfuge, or Death Fugue. So we're going to hear it first in Celan's own voice in the German, then Henry's going to read it for us in English, and then we'll go over to Monica to talk a little bit about the influence that poem particularly has had, as well as the body of Celan's work on the artist Anselm Kiefer. So let me take us to Celan.
Todesfuge. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken sie abends, wir trinken sie mittags und morgens, wir trinken sie nachts, wir trinken und trinken. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt, nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er schreibt es und tritt vor das Haus, und es blitzen die Sterne, er pfeift seine Rüden herbei, er pfeift seine Juden hervor, lässt schaufeln ein Grab in der Erde. Er befiehlt uns, spielt auf nun zum Tanz. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich morgens und mittags, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt, nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Er ruft, stecht tiefer ins Erdreich, ihr einen, ihr andern spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Er greift nach dem Eisen im Gurt, er schwingt, seine Augen sind blau. Stecht tiefer die Spaten, ihr einen, ihr anderen spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags und morgens, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sulamite, er spielt mit den Schlangen. Er ruft, spielt süßer den Tod, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Er ruft, streicht dunkler die Geigen, dann steigt ihr als Rauch in die Luft. Dann habt ihr ein Grab in den Wolken, da liegt man nicht eng. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Wir trinken dich abends und morgens, wir trinken und trinken. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland, sein Auge ist blau. Er trifft dich mit bleierner Kugel, er trifft dich genau. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er hetzt seine Rüden auf uns, er schenkt uns ein Grab in der Luft. Er spielt mit den Schlangen und träumet. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit.
And with an English interpretation, Henry Goodman.
Black milk of daybreak. We drink it at evening. We drink it at midday and morning. We drink it at night. We drink and we drink. We shovel a grave in the air. There you won't lie too cramped. A man lives in the house. He plays with his vipers. He writes. He writes when it grows dark to Deutschland. Your golden hair, Margareta. He writes it and steps out of doors, and the stars are all sparkling. He whistles his hounds to come close. He whistles his Jews into rows, has them shovel a grave in the ground. He commands us to play up for the dance. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night, we drink you at morning. And midday, we drink you at evening, we drink and we drink. A man lives in the house, he plays with his vipers. He writes when it grows dark. To Deutschland, your golden hair, Margarete, your ashen hair. Shulamit. We shovel a grave in the air. There you won't lie too cramped. He shouts, jab the earth deeper, you lot there. You others, sing up and play. He grabs for the rod in his belt. He swings it. His eye is so blue. Jab your spades deeper, you lot there. You others, play for the dancing. Black milk of daybreak, we drink you at night, we drink you at midday and morning. We drink you at evening, we drink and we drink. A man lives in the house, your golden hair, Margareta. Your ashenes hair, Shulamit. He plays his vipers. He shouts, play death more sweetly. This death is a master from Deutschland. He shouts, scrape your strings darker. You'll rise then as smoke to the sky. You'll have a grave then in the clouds. There you won't lie too cramped. Black milk of daybreak. We drink you at night, we drink you at midday. Death is a master aus Deutschland. We drink you at evening and morning, we drink and we drink. This death is ein Meister aus Deutschland. His eye, it is blue. He shoots you with shot made of lead. shoots you level and true. A man lives in a house, your gold in his haar, Margaretha. He looses his hounds on us, grants us a grave in the air. He plays with his vipers and daydreams. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Dein goldenes Haar, Margaretha. Dein aschenes Haar, Schulamit.
Okay. Wow, thank you. I feel like we almost need silence after that. I just think, by the way, Celan himself was a translator, and it's really important to credit translators too. So and it's back to front on the screen, but the translations we're reading from are from this edition, the selected poems and prose of Paul Celan by John Feldsteiner. So he wrote the English translation, but that powerful interpretation was all Henry Goodman's own, and we're very grateful for it. Thank you, Henry. That poem has been interpreted by so many people in so many ways. It's had an impact and influence on artists and makers, creatives in all different forms. But I'm particularly really interested on how it's impacted on visual artists, because we talk about Celan being almost speechless, was the word that was used earlier. But of course, everything he articulates through language itself. Whereas the visual arts, it's a very different form. But Anselm Kiefer in particular was hugely influenced by Todesfuge, by Death Fugue, and interpreted it in his work. And we've got Monica Bohm-Duchen, who's going to talk to us about that and explore the effect that poem had. Monica is actually our host for the evening. We're really delighted to be producing this event in collaboration with Insiders Outsiders, which is a refugee and exiled artists festival. And Monica is not a historian, so she directs that festival, but she herself also is a very renowned art historian, teaching at the Tate, the National Gallery, the Royal Academy of Arts, and the author of several books. I think probably the two most important for this particular event are After Auschwitz, which is Responses to the Holocaust in Contemporary Art, which she published in 1995, and Art in the Second World War from 2013. So over to Monica. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aviva. That Henry was is a very hard act to follow. I will do my best. Let me start without further ado by sharing my screen. Which we probably don't need it. There we go. I feel a little bit of a fraud, I have to confess, on a personal note. I'm not an expert on Celan, although I do remember as a youngster being profoundly moved and impressed, particularly by Death Fugue. So there are resonances to my earlier life and earlier days in what I'm about to say. But I do know quite a lot, and I'm particularly interested as an art historian in the way that artists since the Holocaust have grappled with its enormity and its legacy in their work. And that includes both German artists like Anselm Kiefer and of course Jewish ones too. But let me concentrate on Anselm Kiefer and his relationship to Paul Celan, and most particularly indeed the Todesfuge, the Death Fugue. I start with two book covers which really just serve to confirm, if confirmation is needed, that the two sort of go together. If you think of Paul Celan in relation to the visual arts, then it is, I think, almost without doubt, Anselm Kiefer who comes immediately to mind. It was something of an obsession, certainly a key figure, Celan, for Kiefer, who enabled him to start, I use the word grappling, I'll use it again, grappling in paint, in mixed media, I should say, with the enormity of the legacy of the Holocaust for an artist who was on the side of the perpetrators. These two books both were published, you can see on the left there, 2005, the more detailed volume on the right, major volume, is 2007. But in fact, I want to go right back. We'll come back to that, but let's start sort of at the beginning. Kiefer is one of a fascinating and I think quite deeply problematic generation of German, if I can use that term, artists who were in many cases born just on the cusp of the post-war period. As you can see here, I think he was born on the 8th of March. So, you know, the war hadn't actually ended yet when he was born in the Black Forest area of Germany. His tutor, his main kind of mentor as an artist, as a student, was Joseph Beuys. And I think one needs to be aware that although Kiefer perhaps is the best known of this generation, that there were precursor figures and other people who need to be mentioned perhaps in the same breath, at least by way of introduction. So Joseph Beuys, who was indeed born before the war and experienced the war at first hand, again, I think actually a very problematic but intensely influential figure, but one of the first German artists to make younger artists realize that it was time to engage creatively with the burden of history, if I can put it rather pretentiously. And there are other people one might want to also mention here, more exactly contemporaries. Well, actually, Gerhard Richter is somebody else, again, born actually in the 30s. But among Anselm Kiefer's exact contemporaries, we could think of people like Jörg Immendorf, for example. Georg Baselitz is really important. I mentioned him. You know, really kind of a constellation of interesting artists who are aware of the enormity of their task, let us put it that way. What's going on here? Now, I'm going to play the devil's advocate ever so slightly, and I think, you know, I'm going to leave a lot of questions unanswered in this very short presentation of mine, which I hope we'll have a chance to discuss in the Q&A that follows. He first comes to public attention with a series of site-specific, which we say interventions. These are not paintings, quite clearly, these are photographs of him in sites around Europe, not interestingly enough in Germany itself, but I believe in Switzerland, France, and Italy, a series that he collectively gave the name Occupations in English to in the late 1960s. And what is he up to? Is he playing the devil's advocate? It's a very ambiguous, isn't it? Sort of laden gesture. He is doing the Sieg Heil, he is doing the Hitler salute in public. I put this in because I'm, to be quite honest here, I'm not quite sure what to make of this. Clearly, this marks the beginning, and early, you know, beginning of a fascination, possibly a morbid fascination with the German past, a kind of repulsion and attraction at the same time. Let me leave that for you to ponder. It is very much the last, well, no, it's the recurrent refrain of Margareta and Schulamit that you've already heard so wonderfully in Celan's own recording of his magnificent poem, and then so beautifully rendered by Henry Goodman. But it's the refrain, but yes, it's the two last lines in particular, which just for the record I put here to remind you of Death Fugue. I mustn't go on too long, but it's interesting, it seems to me, that many people have quite wrongly claimed that Celan wrote this poem when he was actually in a concentration camp. Well, he was never in a concentration camp, as we've heard, and he wrote it, in fact, at the end of the war. It was published a few years later. But the Holocaust references are obviously there, you know, absolutely inevitable and sort of indisputable. And it's these two, this kind of tension, the kind of fruitful tension, the dichotomy between the golden-haired Margareta, with implications, of course, of Goethe's Faust. I'll come back to the golden hair references a little bit later, and Schulamit, one thing actually that intrigues me, and again, it's something perhaps we can discuss later between us, and maybe the audience will have some ideas, is also how often both Kiefer and also in the translations of his works, but also I think in work about commentaries on Celan, how the names are actually spelt differently. They remain essentially the same names, but the variations in spelling are quite intriguing. Just leave that again as an open question. So Shulamit, obviously a reference to the Song of Songs, to also the Nazarene group of 19th century German painters who saw Shulamit as the embodiment of the Old Testament and Margareta, as the embodiment of the new, just an interesting and perhaps less familiar aspect of the pairing of the two women's names. But above all, it's mediated, of course it is, through the poetry of Celan. And it was in the early 80s, it seems, that, perhaps surprisingly not before, given that Celan had died in 1970, by this time, you know, particularly Death Fugue had become an almost iconic poetic text. But it seems to be in around 1980 and onwards, as we'll see, that Kiefer begins, well, really a kind of obsessive connection, engagement, grappling with the implications, the symbolic and indeed also very physical implications of the pairing of these two symbolic female figures. And I start with one of the very first, 1980. Interesting that he's not yet moved to his signature use of straw as emblematizing the golden hair. I'll come back to that in a minute. Here we have the waving corn, haven't we? A sort of sense of fertility, of possibly blood and soil kind of connections to the Germanness of the landscape, but very, very typical nevertheless in the way that the handwritten inscription by the artist himself kind of forms a rhythmic element in the whole composition. So it is a fairly conventionally rendered work in the sense that it's watercolor, as you can see, gouache and acrylic on paper. It's also quite small. So this is a kind of tentative beginning. The handling of paint gets more urgent, you might say. The move into that idea of hair as straw blonde in English, but also in German, is perhaps coming closer here, but still essentially a two-dimensional work and still fairly small. And then here we see, and there are many other, incidentally, other variations on the theme of Margareta that I could show you. I think it's true to say, and I hope somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, that in terms of sheer numbers, he produced many, many more visual variations on the theme of Your Golden Hair, Margareta, than he did with Shulamit. But again, something to ponder there. So here, as you can see, more, again, a kind of urgent, but even less illustrative work, where he is for the first time, or for one of the first times, incorporating actual straw onto the surface of the work. But notice also the black smoke, the grave in the sky implications, the ashen hair also in the mix. This is one of the best known of his Margareta canvases, 1981, and I've just put below, in some cases, the media he uses to show that, you know, these are increasingly mixed media works and becoming more and more like reliefs rather than traditional paintings, which is a path he continues to develop in his later career, as you may know. Hair, flame, when straw is burnt, does it turn to ash? The darkness, the grey underneath, the pinpricks of light. I think we need to think here, and again, I hope this will provide fruit for discussion later, you know, the essential differences, some of the fundamental differences between the painted image or the mixed media image and the written word, or indeed the spoken word. The sheer physicality of Kiefer's work is a very far cry, isn't it, from the poetry, which is so much more suggestive. And also I was struck very much, Gideon, by what you were saying about the fact that Celan was a great admirer of clay, which I didn't actually know. And if imagine most of you have some kind of visual image in your mind's eye of Paul Klé's work. It couldn't be more different in its delicacy and small scaleness to the increasingly large scale, possibly one might even say, and again, I'm just, you know, trying to get us to think critically about Kiefer, the bombastic nature, possibly, the overportentous nature of his work. They are powerful, don't get me wrong. And another one you can see, they're very much clustered in this short period in the early 1980s, the Margareta series, the scorched landscape, the combination of the dark, ashen, you know, the kind of sort of associations with the golden hair, the straw that is so, you know, volatile, so easily burnt, but also, of course, does refer quite literally to the straw blonde hair of the mistress of the Nazi commandant, maybe, but also, as I've already suggested, to many other things besides. And then the other side of the coin, and I think it is undoubtedly necessary to see the pairings. I mean, you know, they're not, yeah, I mean, you know, Kiefer was intensely aware from the poem above all, but also I think sort of taking the symbolism beyond the poem itself of the importance of seeing Shulamit, the Shulamite, as we'll see, as the twin, if you like, the dark twin, possibly the bright twin of the apparently golden haired, yes, the golden girl, the golden Margareta figure. And it's interesting to see how he begins to grapple with this pairing in his work. Some of the works, as you can see here, these are once more mixed media, bringing in real, you know, sort of straw, for example, in the bottom corner here. This dark, brooding, ravaged landscape, which is the kind of the counterpart, if you like, to the brighter, golden, but obviously shadowed landscapes of the Margareta series. And that kind of coming together of the darkness and the brightness, the ashen hair, the golden hair, is, you know, head on here, I think, as did in a work like this, where the two kind of do battle with each other, if you like, in a very, very tactile and physical and almost aggressive sort of way in this abstract, but actually not quite abstract composition. Also interesting, and I must confess, until I delved into this further, I wasn't aware that he was initially toying with the idea, if that's the word, experimenting with the notion of a more figurative approach, because actually Kiefer, as you may know, is not generally a figurative painter in the literal sense of the word, using the human form. It doesn't happen that often, but he's clearly experimenting here, isn't he, with the female nude figure, cascading hair. There are echoes, I think, of Edvard Munch among various other kind of symbolist, sort of femme fatale sort of figure, I think, creeps in to the meaning of these two works, but with the kind of cascade of Ashenahar, the ashen hair of Celan's poem. But as far as I know, this didn't take him, or it didn't take him very far. He didn't actually do very many images of this kind, but I think it does throw an interesting light on the kind of creative process, the kind of evolution of his ideas about this series. Small scale, again, these ones. Now, I think I'm right in saying, and I don't think many people would contradict me if I said that of all the works dealing with Shulamit, or the Shulamite, it's very much an Old Testament reference in the English title here, this is the one that most people will have come across. There are, in fact, several variations, all fairly similar, but I'll just stick, for reasons of time, with this one here, and you can see once more the kind of interesting kind of amalgam of different unconventional media brought to bear to create this image. Well, look at the size. I mean, we're getting very, very large indeed. And this becomes very much the pattern of Kiefer's work, as I say, very much in contrast to the small scale preoccupations of an artist like Paul Klee. I don't know, I mean, clearly there are architectural references here, and I will just briefly show you one such, with apologies for the not very good quality of the photograph, but it's very evident that one of the visual and indeed symbolic sort of references in Shulamite, yeah, is quite physically, yes, architecturally speaking, to this now, of course, loaded and, you know, symbolically very fraught sort of architectural project by Wilhelm Kreis, done as a kind of memorial hall for great German soldiers just prior to the Second World War. So that, of course, lends a deeply loaded, you know, sort of Nazi Third Reich related aspect to the painting, and that's clearly his intention. You've got, I mean, there are many things one could say about this work, not least its scale and its kind of brooding colours, but notice also the flames relating perhaps to the flames atop the straw hair of Margareta that we looked at briefly before, but also reminiscent perhaps of, well, memorial candles, of indeed perhaps a menorah, the idea of a sacrificial space here, not dedicated to German soldiery, but of course to the victims of the Holocaust, because I'm sure you have also had flitting across your brains as you look at this image, even in reproduction, and these works don't reproduce very well on a flat screen, but I'm sure that you were also put in mind of the gas chambers, the crematoria, yes, the kind of the very, very, very kind of, you know, unavoidable Holocaust Nazi death camp references of this work. The obsession, and I do use that word quite intentionally, with Shulamit in particular, and I think this is actually again quite significant. He seems to have left the Margareta figure sort of, you know, alone, if that's the right word way of putting it, in the early 80s. But the concept of Shulamit is a lasting one. He continues there, you know, he goes on to do many different things, and his work gets ever more ambitious in its references to all manner of cosmic and global historical events. But Shulamit remains a preoccupation. As you can see, here we are in 1990, and again, I do apologize, it's a rather fuzzy image. It was surprisingly hard to find good quality images of this three-dimensional work. I don't know how many of you will have seen both his paintings in the flesh, as it were, and indeed his three-dimensional works, sort of extraordinarily textured, kind of pitted sorts of surfaces. And look at the materials: soldered lead, female hair, yeah, and actual ashes. Is it too literal? But it's also very open-ended. And lastly, which takes us back to the early 2000s and those two books that I started off with, a work of 2006, Aschenblume. I was intrigued by, I'm not a sort of a good German speaker, but Aschen is, I think, plural and Blume is singular. So it's ashes flower. It's not ash flower, as it's sometimes translated. For Paul Celan, I mean, quite clearly here we are, bringing us much closer to the present: oil, acrylic emulsion, shellac, and burned books on canvas. So quite clearly here we are moving away from a sort of primary focus on the death fugue imagery to other aspects of Paul Celan's work, and also, of course, a much wider kind of tribute, a kind of homage, an apology, is it? But also a fascination with the Nazi past. And I will leave it at that. I hope I've just sort of opened things up for discussion. And of course, well, going back to one of the central points that I think has to be at the heart of our discussion today is, you know, what happens when a painter, and a painter particularly like Anselm Kiefer, transmutes, if you were, yes, metamorphoses into paint and a mixed media, encrusted, very physical format, words on a page. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monica. I'm going to leave Monica on screen, but also bring up Anne, Gideon, Henry as well. And I'm going to ask our Jewish Renaissance editor, Rebecca Taylor, to join us. So Rebecca's been monitoring the chats across the different fora, and she's going to chair the Q&A for the next little bit of our session. So if any of you in the audience still have burning questions, please do type your questions in. Rebecca.
Thank you, Aviva, and thank you to all of our panelists for your varied and interesting and very moving responses to Paul Celan and his work. It's just been a real pleasure and honor to listen to all of you. And I've got some messages in that have been sent in. I'll read them out because I think they convey that sense of appreciation that our audience is feeling at this time as well. So we have a lovely message for Anne from Elizabeth Rees. And she says, "Thank you so much, Anne. That was incredibly beautiful. And your words are so wise and nuanced. I love your work and thank you for how it's changed my life." Thank you, that's to Anne. And then I have a few more. One which was from Spain, I think, from Anya Gaona. "I send a warm greeting to all cultivators of the love of Paul Celan's poetry, which opens us to the light of understanding the miracle of language. Long live his memory, long live the poetry." And another from Judy Herman, and she says, "I wanted to thank Henry Goodman for his devastating and extraordinarily moving reading of Death Fugue. And I felt you were engaging me personally with your eyes. I'm sure others will have felt the same." Certainly, that was an incredibly powerful reading, Henry. Thank you again for that. So we have had, we've had some questions in, and I'll go to those now so that we give our audience time to have responses from people. So firstly, I've had a question from Geeta, who asks, "Where and when was Celan's recitation of Death Fugue recorded?" Perhaps Gideon might be able to answer that.
No, I can't.
Anyone else? Can anyone else offer any illumination?
I can help a little bit. So there were 2 recordings that Celan did in his lifetime that were deliberate recordings for audio. One was 6 of his own poems, and the other was he did a series of recordings of translations he'd made. Now, the recording that I played you, I first heard via John Felsteiner in one of his talks, but nowadays it's widely available on YouTube. I did try and trace it, and as far as I can tell, those 2 sets of recordings, one was made in the 1950s in Frankfurt, and one was made in Stuttgart in the 60s, but I'm not sure which way round it was that was his personal poems and the translations, but it was very much, the Toes was very much a deliberate recording for audio. And actually it's now available via CD. There's a CD of all the recordings of Celan's work that you can get in German. And I can't remember the name exact. I think it might be, I don't have German as a language, but I think it's something like Ich wollte sagen is the name of the CD that you can get. Someone will probably correct my pronunciation there.
Eva, wonderful. Wonderful information, you. That was terrific. Would anyone else like to add anything about the recordings? Okay, I'll move on to another question. I hope that's answered Geeta's question. I'll move on to a query from Victoria Pollack, who asks, "With Margarita, are we not dealing also with a reference to Goethe's Faust as a symbol of a loss of German innocence?" So I think Monica...
I mentioned it, didn't I, briefly?
Mentioning it, we can talk about that in general. I mean, Margarita, if I remember, she in the Faust, she kills her babies. Is that right? She's a murderess, I think. Monica, would you like to talk a little bit about that and perhaps how it appears in Anselm Kiefer's work?
Well, again, I think it's very much, Kiefer accessing or making reference to the other possible meanings of these 2 symbolic figures, but it's through Celan, isn't it? So one could equally argue that for Celan too, the multiplicity of references, but also Goethe. I mean, the epitome of Germanic and German culture, civilization. I think that's again a very loaded and sort of darkly ironic sort of reference, isn't it? The specifics of the Margarita figure aside, but they're also clearly important.
Okay. Would would anyone else like to talk about the references to German culture? I wanted to ask Gideon, because when we first started corresponding, Gideon, about your film, you told me you'd been on this amazing trip to places that were significant in Celan's life, and you'd been to Northern Holland and visited Martin Heidegger's hut. Could you tell us a little bit about the Heidegger connection?
That wasn't Holland, that was Bavaria.
Sorry, Bavaria.
It's in Tottenham. Celan visited Heidegger, and there's a very and wrote a poem, Tottenham, which is his sort of response to that meeting, and I think it was a very profound and expression of an inner conflict, in a way, that Celan experienced. And the hut was not just where Heidegger was, but in some sense it was a kind of embodiment of Heidegger. So I think it's not just a meeting with the man, but it was a meeting with a certain sort of environment and landscape, which is very visceral when I went there.
Just to pick up on that, if I may, is that okay if I come in there?
Yes, please do.
He challenged Heidegger very forcefully about his early Nazi connections, and didn't get the answer that he hoped to get, and consciously used in the poem that Gideon just mentioned, the original poem to Nelly Sachs. So there's a lot of interesting comment about the use of forms, the use of very similar lines, and whereas one was a person of love and affection and the complexity of their relationship, the other one was, by the time he visited Heidegger, was a savage disappointment, it seems to me, to Celan, this great thinker and so on. And while the woman who he shares so much, as we've heard so articulately, with so deeply, Nelly Sachs, says we don't know what counts, we don't know, but there's a great compassion in her. But with Heidegger, he gets a dryness and a lack of responsibility from the accounts that are given, and reuses in the poem the same structures. So I find that very interesting. And just briefly on the Shulamit contrast with Margareta, the German may be speaking to his wife, he may be speaking to his loved one or whatever, and fantasizing about her. And that's what leads me to feel, and it is a very personal interpretation, I accept that there's a part of Celan saying, I claim Shulamit, I present Shulamit, and the biblical story, who actually she was described as dark and comely, beautiful and dark. I'm sure in very short shrift we will see a wonderful black actress play Shulamit at some point, and that will be great. In other words, I think there is a reclaiming of the narrative of what is German going on for me in the poem. So enough said.
Yeah.
I might just leap in for one moment, sorry, because it's very interesting that with the poem Death Fugue, that he read it at every reading, and also that whenever he published it, whenever it was in print, he put a blank page before the poem and a blank page after, so there wouldn't be any leaking through of to the other poems in the volume. There's such a profoundly visceral feeling about how language works and how language works on the page and how it works in reference to the reader. Yeah.
Thank you.
And do you think I mean, there's a strong sense of bearing witness, and you wrote about this for me in the current edition of Jewish Renaissance, and the need to bear witness, and the sense of responsibility of speaking about the things that happened in the war. What about the encouragement to act and to have action? Is there a call to act in his poems, do you think?
Well, I was very bleak in my comments at the beginning, and the bleakness was from the perspective of the poet. But for the reader, in fact, always you have a sense with him, and I'm sure, why do we write? I mean, it's again and again confronting the meaninglessness, to try and make meaning, to try and make sense of what seems meaningless. And so, indeed, there is always, I think, in every voice, a call to action implied. It is, I think the difference with Celan is that he has to write, and the facts the same thing. They have to write. They have to confront the meaninglessness. It is their compulsion, their drive, their impulse, their moral core to do this. Their own relationship to break down Celan's suicide. We have to surmise that the despair of that took over, but in setting those words down on the page, even as I said before, even if you do not anticipate a listener, there is the page itself that listens. Mm-hmm. And we are, yes, I think absolutely there's a cry, even if it's only the dead who hear you.
Can I respond to that very briefly? Because Rebecca was asking about a call to action, but I think there's also a call to speech. I'm really interested in the fact that for so many other writers who are also post-Holocaust writers, they talk about how it was Celan beginning to speak that opened up for them the possibility of speaking in turn. So whether it's Primo Levi or Elie Wiesel, people we now think as iconic kind of narrators of Holocaust experience, both of them had so much trouble initially putting pen to paper and saying what they wanted to say. And both of them say it was reading and hearing Celan that moved them to be able to open up their own words. And in fact, even Primo Levi, I think it's his book, If Not Now, When, but he takes that phrase, a grave in the air, as his starting point. So whether or not it's a call to action, I think speech is a kind of action. And that actually when there was no way of describing what had happened, saying you can kind of begin to put words to it, and you can, as Celan said, it's the poets of memory, the poets of testimony he himself wanted to translate back into German, kind of that instinct towards we have to make people listen. You know, it's not just we have to speak, but we have to get people to listen to each other. And I think that's at the core of a kind of social justice narrative.
Thanks, Aviva, and to Anne. Have we got a bit more time, Aviva? Because I'm actually getting in quite a lot of questions.
Yeah, we can take it a bit longer, a few more minutes.
Okay, I will read out these questions, and maybe anyone who would like to can pick these up. So from Martin Motz, as the son of Austrian refugees, I relate to Celan's mixed emotions caused by the contamination of the German language as we reflect on the Holocaust, whose legacy is still with us. I personally have accepted the associated forward-looking challenge of taking on Austrian nationality as a committed Brit. Can you envisage an event in 100 years' time about the positive experiences that may emerge from people like me? That's a real commitment to optimism, and yeah, an optimistic proposal, Martin.
I can just offer one thing.
Yeah.
I've just read an audio reading of The Order of the Day by Eric Wiard about the Viennese capitulation. And I would say to him that it's wonderful if there can be forces at play today to join the Austrians that do want to change their legacy and the DNA that's still in the blood system to be overcome. So it's great that there are people like him there that want to be part of that counterbalancing and to realign the unavoidable historical factors that we know existed and still exist.
Okay. Unless anyone would like to.
Well, I was just going to add that it's not a hope of restoration. It's not a hope directed to the past. It's a hope directed to the future. It's not, we can't restore, but we can act in the only way we can, which is looking ahead.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on now so that we can get these questions in. Liz Cashton asks, is the back view of the salute in the early photograph also an echo of Caspar David? That's for Monica. Regarding,
yes, I think he's engaging with a whole legacy of German Romanticism. Caspar David Friedrich, the sort of archetypal landscape painter of the 19th century, communing with nature. Yes, absolutely, there are multiple references, but I think the one that hits one in the face for being, deliberately subversive, of course, is the reference to the Hitler salute. But yes, Friedrich is there, definitely.
And we also have Elizabeth Rees asks, were there any particular psychiatrists who worked with either Paul Celan or Nellie Sachs who have written about their work?
I don't know about working, well, in fact, he didn't work in a clinical way with Celan, but Jean Starobinski, who's better known as a scholar of literature and a philosopher and an essayist, was by training a psychiatrist, and he was a friend of Celan's, and a very profound person in his own right. But Celan was, as I'm sure you all know, in a psychiatric hospital on several occasions during his lifetime. So whether there were psychiatrists who were known as writers in their own right who treated him, I don't know.
Okay. Thank you, Gideon. There's so much more here that we could carry on talking about, but I'd just like to give a final word to Anne, Monica, and Gideon before we wrap up. Your final thoughts on Celan and his significance for us today. So perhaps we can start with Anne. Is there something you'd like to say in conclusion?
I'm just looking for something that I'd like to read, just a sentence or two, if you can bear with me, or someone can go ahead and you can come back to me.
Okay. Yes, okay. Monica, is there something you'd like to say?
And many things. I think, going back to what's been said about the Margareta Shulamit dynamic. I mean, they're of course both part of what Germany was all about, and I think, you know, that is why they're so totally inextricable, and it remains the case that, you know, absolutely. But can I also perhaps just pick up on what Anne was saying about the centrality of meaninglessness? And that is, it seems to me, a very, not merely sober, but actually a rather dark and bleak point of view, Anne. And, you know, I adore your writing, and I'm not going to criticize in any way what you're saying, but it seems to me that actually perhaps what Aviva touched on, that actually it is a call for speech, it's the compulsion to make not sense exactly, but to actually put into words that which cannot be put into words. I always think of Elie Wiesel. I often quote the, I think it's from One Generation After, to my students. He said very succinctly, he said, how is, in reference to the Holocaust, how is one to speak of it? Big question mark. How is one not to speak of it? And it seems to me that sums up the ultimate dilemma that we continue to face.
Thank you. Gideon, is there something you'd like to add to what we've talked about tonight?
No, other than to people that are listening this evening, and if they haven't read Paul Celan, I just encourage them to read him and to discover him. And there's actually a story that comes to mind. I met several years ago, I met Eric Celan, Paul Celan's son, and we were having dinner together. And in the middle of dinner, he said that there's something he wants to show me. And he got up and he went into the other room, and he came back with a beaten leather wallet. And he handed it to me, and he said, this wallet was found, it's the only thing that was found on my father's person when he was recovered from the Seine, when his body was recovered from the Seine. And I sort of held this wallet very tentatively and nervously. And he said, open it up. And I opened it up and it looked empty. And he said, no, look in it. There's something in there. I want you to find what's in there. And I sort of opened up the wallet and then saw there was a piece of paper. And I pulled a piece of paper out. And it was a ticket to go and see Waiting for Godot. And that's all he had on him when he committed suicide. And I thought there was something kind of extraordinary about the story and about being able to sort of witness it in that direct way.
Thank you. Henry. I was going to say, should we have Anne and then Henry, maybe, and then we'll go back to Aviva to wrap up.
I was just going to read a couple of lines. When Celan wrote, his intention was poetry's intention. He was genuine, pure in his commitment to the idea and ideals of what a poem can achieve. Reading Celan and any poet who stakes their moral soul on their words challenges us to offer in solidarity what their words offer us, to be seen, to remember, to witness, to be called to action. It is not the hope of restoration. We know that is impossible. It is instead the one chance history does offer us to redeem not the past, but the future.
I have a very brief statement. There is a wonderful thought that to be an artist in any field, photography, cinema, theatre, dance, anything, is to make a promise to respond. And I think that is one of the great things that Paul Celan hands to us, is the responsibility to make a promise to oneself to redress things by responding, shaping your experience and so on. So promising to respond is a legacy of Celan, in my view.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, everybody. Aviva, would you like to take over?
Well, actually, I'm very taken by both what Anne and Henry said. For Anne about the future, and for Henry about that idea of response, because they feed beautifully into our ending. So we've been really lucky to have access to some of the early work Gideon's done on his film. So it's with full credit to him and saying, please kind of do go and watch it when the documentary is finished and out. But we're going to finish with an excerpt from his film, which is an interview with George Steiner. He reads a poem of Celan's, and then actually he talks about what he hopes the future response to Celan will be. So it's a very fitting way to kind of take Anne and Henry's thoughts and take it on that one step further. So I'm just going to say a huge, huge thank you to all of you, to Rebecca for chairing the questions, to Henry for reading to us so beautifully, and Gideon, Anne and Monica for sharing their own art and art history, in Monica's case, their own responses to Celan's work. And we'll finish with the words of George Steiner on Celan. Danielle, please will you cue it up for us? Thank you.
Tübingen, Jänner. Zu Blindheit überredete Augen ihre. Sein Rätsel ist rein entsprungenes, ihre Erinnerung an schwimmende Hölderl in Türme, Möwen umschwirrt. Besuche ertrunkener Schreiner bei diesen tauchenden Worten. Käme ein Mensch zur Welt, heute mit dem Lichtbad der Patriarchen. Er dürfte, sprach er von dieser Zeit, er dürfte nur lallen und lallen, immer zu. Palaksch. The lallen is miraculous, isn't it? But the time will come. The time will come. There's a wonderful passage in Walter Benjamin, whom we've already mentioned, about the books in libraries which are standing there silently because it'll take a couple of 100 years before people will know how to read them. And Benjamin adds, the books are in no hurry. And in my opinion, that's key to the future of Celan. Celan is in no hurry.